History is full of fascinating events, but over time, many of these events have been surrounded by myths and legends. Some of these stories were created to make history sound more exciting, while others were spread by mistake or used as tools for propaganda. What makes these myths powerful is that they are easy to remember, dramatic, and often more entertaining than the truth. That's why even today, people continue to believe them, passing them down through books, movies, and even classrooms. From Albert Einstein supposedly failing math, to the story of Isaac Newton being hit on the head by an apple, these tales have become part of popular culture. They sound simple and inspiring, but they often hide the real facts. The same can be said about Christopher Columbus proving the earth is round, George Washington's cherry tree confession, or Marie Antoinette's cold words, "Let them eat cake." In most cases, these stories were never true to begin with. They were either exaggerated, misunderstood, or completely made up. The interesting thing is that these myths continue to shape how we think about famous figures and events. They show us how storytelling can be stronger than reality. When a story is easy to tell and fits the mood of the time, people are more likely to remember it, even if it is false. By looking closely at these myths, we can see how history is not just about facts, but also about how those facts are told and retold over generations. Hey everyone, before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these fascinating stories. Today, we're uncovering 11 famous historical myths that most people still believe. Some of them will really surprise you. Einstein and math. One of the most popular myths says Albert Einstein failed math in school. People love this story because it makes him look like an ordinary kid who later became a genius. But the truth is very different. Einstein was actually excellent at math from an early age. By the time he was 12, he had already mastered algebra and geometry. The confusion started because of the grading system at that time. Later, people misread it as failure. His teachers did find him annoying because he asked too many questions, but he was never bad at math. In fact, math was one of his strongest subjects, and it became the foundation for his world-changing theories. Columbus and the round earth. We've all heard that Christopher Columbus proved the earth is round. But that's not true. Scholars had known for centuries that the earth was round. Ancient Greeks had even calculated its size. Columbus's real challenge wasn't proving the Earth's shape, it was miscalculating the distance to Asia. He thought Asia was much closer than it actually was. When he reached the Americas, he believed he had found Asia. Later storytellers turned his journey into a heroic myth about discovering that the Earth was round, when in fact, people already knew it. George Washington and the cherry tree. Father, I cannot tell a lie. This famous line comes from the story that young George Washington cut down his father's cherry tree and then confessed honestly. The tale became a symbol of Washington's honesty, but in reality, this never happened. A writer named Mason Weems invented the story after Washington's death to make him look like a moral role model. While Washington was indeed respected for his character, the cherry tree story is pure fiction. The Chicago Fire and the Cow. In 1871, a huge fire broke out in Chicago and burned for 2 days. It destroyed thousands of buildings, left many people homeless, and became one of the most famous disasters in American history. Soon after, a story spread that the fire began in a small barn. People said Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern, which started the flames. The idea of a simple cow causing such a big disaster caught everyone's attention. Newspapers loved this version because it was dramatic and easy to tell. But historians later found no real proof that the cow started the fire. In fact, the exact cause of the fire was never discovered. Sadly, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow were blamed for years. Even though she denied the story, people continued to repeat it, and it became part of popular culture. The myth was stronger than the truth. In reality, the fire could have started in many different ways, maybe from a drop match, a spark, or some other accident. But the cow story was so memorable that it became the most famous version, even though it wasn't true. Newton and the Apple. The story of Isaac Newton and the falling apple is one of the most famous tales in science. According to legend, an apple dropped onto his head, and in that very moment, he suddenly discovered the law of gravity. This version is often told in schools because it makes a complex idea sound simple and dramatic. But the truth is not so instant or magical. Newton did observe apples falling from trees, and this inspired him to think deeply about why objects always fall straight down to the ground instead of sideways or upward. The falling apple sparked curiosity, but it was just the beginning of his journey. Newton didn't immediately come up with the full law of gravity. Instead, he spent nearly 20 years studying mathematics, astronomy, and physics. Through long calculations and observations, he slowly developed a theory that explained how gravity works on Earth and in space. The detail about the apple hitting his head was added later to make the story more entertaining. It gave people an easy way to remember Newton's discovery, even though there is no evidence that such an accident ever happened. It's more likely that he simply watched an apple drop and began to wonder. The myth of the apple on the head survives because it simplifies a very complex achievement. While the story isn't literally true, it reminds us that great discoveries often begin with small moments of curiosity and simple questions about the world around us. Nero and the Fire of Rome. In 64 AD, a massive fire swept through Rome, destroying much of the city and leaving thousands of people homeless. Over time, a dramatic legend grew that Emperor Nero stood by and watched the city burn while playing a fiddle. This image made him appear careless and cruel, as if he enjoyed the suffering of his people. The problem with this story is that it is historically impossible. The fiddle, or violin, did not even exist during Nero's lifetime. Ancient Rome did have stringed instruments, but none that matched the description of a fiddle. The story was created much later as a way to criticize his rule. In reality, some historical accounts suggest that Nero actually tried to help. Records say he opened his own gardens to shelter people who lost their homes and organized food supplies for the hungry. He also began rebuilding Rome, introducing new safety measures to prevent such disasters in the future. So why did the myth stick? Nero was already unpopular with many groups, especially the Roman elite. He was seen as extravagant, unpredictable, and even dangerous. The fire gave his enemies the perfect opportunity to portray him as a heartless villain, and the fiddle story became an easy way to symbolize that image. The legend of Nero fiddling while Rome burned has lasted for centuries, not because it is true, but because it tells a powerful story. It shows how myths can shape history, turning leaders into symbols of evil even when the facts suggest a more complicated reality. Marie Antoinette and Let Them Eat Cake. During the French Revolution, one of the most famous quotes linked to Queen Marie Antoinette was, "Let them eat cake." The story says she spoke these words when she heard that poor people had no bread, suggesting they could eat something more luxurious instead. To many, this made her look cold and heartless. However, historians agree that Marie Antoinette never actually said this. The phrase had appeared years earlier in a book written by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, long before she was even queen. At the time Rousseau wrote it, Marie Antoinette was just a child living in Austria. The misunderstanding happened because the quote fit perfectly with the anger people felt during the revolution. France was suffering from food shortages, and the royal family was seen as living in luxury while common people starved. Pinning the words on the queen made her the perfect symbol of cruelty and excess. Revolutionary leaders spread the story as propaganda. By portraying Marie Antoinette as selfish and disconnected from reality, they turned public opinion even more strongly against her. The quote became a tool to justify removing her from power and eventually executing her. In truth, Marie Antoinette may have been a queen who lived in wealth, but there's no evidence she ever dismissed her people so harshly. The Let Them Eat Cake story is a myth that stuck because it captured the emotions of the time, not the reality of her words. The War of the Worlds broadcast. In 1938, a young director named Orson Welles performed a radio broadcast of War of the Worlds. The drama was presented like a series of live news reports, describing an alien invasion happening in real time. Listeners heard announcements of strange objects falling from the sky and terrifying Martian attacks. The legend says that millions of Americans believed the broadcast was real and went into a state of mass panic. Stories claim that people fled their homes, clogged roads, or even called the police, thinking the world was under attack. This tale of chaos has been repeated for decades as one of the most shocking media events in history. But the truth is much smaller. Only a small number of people were actually listening to the program that night. Most Americans were tuned into other shows. Those who did hear War of the Worlds usually realized it was a drama, not real news. The myth of mass hysteria grew because newspapers exaggerated the story the next day. At that time, radio was becoming a strong competitor to print media. By making radio look dangerous and irresponsible, newspapers hoped to protect their own influence. The panic story became more useful than the reality. Today, the broadcast is remembered more for the myth than for the actual event. It shows how powerful storytelling can shape public memory, even when the truth is very different. The War of the Worlds panic was more fiction than fact, but it remains one of the most famous examples of media legend. The birth date of Jesus. Every year, millions of people celebrate Christmas on December 25th, believing it to be the birthday of Jesus Christ. The holiday has become one of the most important Christian traditions around the world. But when we look closely at history, the Bible never actually mentions December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth. In fact, the Bible gives no exact day or even month for when Jesus was born. The only details we find are about the manger, the shepherds, and the wise men. Because of this, historians and scholars agree that the true date of Jesus' birth remains unknown. So why December 25th? Early Christians decided on this date centuries later. At the time, there were already popular pagan festivals in late December, such as the Roman celebration of Saturnalia and the winter solstice. Choosing December 25th helped Christianity blend with existing traditions, making it easier for people to accept the new faith. Over time, this date became widely accepted as the official celebration of Jesus' birth. The symbolism of light overcoming darkness during winter also fit perfectly with the Christian message of hope and salvation. This helped December 25th gain deep meaning, even though it was never confirmed as the real birthday. Today, most people focus more on the spirit of Christmas love, giving, and unity rather than the exact historical accuracy of the date. The tradition of December 25th has lasted for centuries, but it's important to remember that the actual birth date of Jesus is still a mystery. The Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials took place in 1692 in the town of Salem, Massachusetts. During this time, fear of witchcraft spread quickly, and many people believed that witches were working with the devil. This fear led to one of the most tragic events in early American history. A common myth says that the accused witches in Salem were burned alive at the stake. This image often comes from movies, books, and stories that try to make the trials sound even more dramatic. But in reality, no one in Salem was burned to death. The actual method of execution was hanging. 19 people were convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to death by hanging. They were taken to Gallows Hill and executed publicly, which made the fear of witchcraft even stronger at that time. There was also one man, Giles Corey, who faced a very unusual punishment. He refused to enter a plea in court, so the authorities pressed him with heavy stones until he died. His death was meant to force a confession, but instead, it became a symbol of resistance. Burning witches at the stake was much more common in Europe, where thousands of people were executed in that way. Over time, people confused those European practices with what happened in Salem, creating the false belief that witches in America were burned too. The myth stuck because burning sounded more shocking and horrifying than hanging. It made the story more memorable and easier to exaggerate in later retellings. This is why many people still imagine fires and stakes when they hear about Salem. In truth, the Salem witch trials were already tragic enough without the myth. Innocent people lost their lives because of fear, suspicion, and false accusations. The story reminds us how dangerous mass hysteria can be and why it's so important to separate myths from facts in history. Paul Revere's Ride. The story goes that Paul Revere rode through the night shouting, "The British are coming," to warn colonists of the attack. The truth is more complicated. Revere was one of several riders spreading the message, and he never completed his ride. He was captured by the British. The phrase, "the British are coming," is also unlikely because most colonists still considered themselves British. Instead, he probably gave a quieter, more specific warning. But later poems and stories turned Revere into the lone hero, making the legend bigger than the truth. These 11 famous myths remind us that history is not always as simple as the stories we hear. Legends like Newton's apple, Nero's fiddle, or the Salem witches being burned at the stake are powerful because they turn complex events into short, memorable lessons. But in doing so, they often distort reality. Behind every myth lies a more complicated truth, one that requires careful study and critical thinking to uncover. What makes these myths last for centuries is their ability to inspire, shock, or entertain. A child struggling with math feels motivated by the Einstein story, while the dramatic image of a cow starting the Chicago fire captures our imagination. Yet, the real lessons of history are much deeper than these simplified versions. By separating myths from facts, we gain a clearer picture of the past and avoid repeating the mistakes of misunderstanding. In the end, myths will always exist because people love stories. But as students of history, we have the responsibility to look beyond the surface, question what we hear, and search for the truth. These myths may not be accurate, but they remind us of the power of storytelling and why it is so important to know the difference between legend and reality. If you enjoyed these surprising myths, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing history stories. And comment below which myth shocked you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts.